Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on dealing with leaks in the age of AI and disinformation. My name is Robert Libetti. I was a fellow at the Nieman Foundation for Journalism here at Harvard this year. Prior to that, I spent about 10 years at the Wall Street Journal, where I started and led a team that produced visual investigations and investigative documentaries. And while here at Harvard this year, I and one of our panelists today, Sandrine Rigaud, we took a class at the Harvard Kennedy School, which was called Technology, Privacy, and the Transnational Nature of the Internet, with Professor Jim Waldo. And it was a fantastic class. And at the end of it, we decided to do a final project that would be sort of like a guide for journalists to deal with leaks in this time of changing technology and changing media. And so we spoke to a lot of prominent journalists around the world and got their tips on how they were navigating the world of leaks right now. And so we thought it would make a helpful guide. And I think since we've written that, I think the need to understand this has grown. There's a lot happening in the US, in the government, that requires transparency. So I think these tips are even more relevant today. And so we thought we'd try and recreate just a bit of that for you here today with this webinar. And so we have three really great panelists with us today. And I'd like to introduce them. First off is Mark MacGann. Mark has 30 years of experience at the nexus of business and government, having served in global senior executive and management roles for some of the world's most successful corporations. He's a former Uber executive, a whistleblower, and now he's a fellow at Harvard's Public Interest Tech Lab here at the Shorenstein Center. We also have with us today Sandrine Rigaud, a French investigative journalist and filmmaker who was part of the 2025 Nieman class at Harvard. She most recently served as editor-in-chief of Forbidden Stories, a global network of journalists pursuing the work of silenced journalists. She has coordinated many cross-border investigations, including the Pegasus Project, a leak-based international project that revealed how governments spied on journalists, opposition politicians, activists, lawyers, and others using Pegasus spyware. And we also have with us Paul Radu. He is co-founder and head of innovation at OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. OCCRP is one of the largest investigative journalism organizations in the world, headquartered in Amsterdam and with staff across 6 continents. Paul leads OCCRP's major investigative projects, scopes regional expansion, and develops new strategies and technology to expose organized crime and corruption across borders. So welcome, everybody, and thanks for being here to discuss this. And I'd like to just start with a basic, just start from the beginning and sort of with a basic question for you, Sandrine. And we've discussed a little bit of this amongst ourselves, but how would you classify the different places leaks can come from? And what does that mean for how trustworthy a leak can be? And how do you deal with the different sources?
Thanks, Robert, for the introduction. And just to start with a quick reminder, I've been working as a journalist for more than 20 years now. And at that time, getting a leak was an exception. It was a Christmas gift. 10 years ago, every investigative journalist dreamt of being Bastian Obermeier, the amazing German journalist who got the Panama paper leaks, which became this huge story about how offshore companies were using for money laundering and tax evasion purposes. This has, of course, tremendously changed, and this is the reason why we're doing that webinar. Now we are producing so many data as individuals, as a society, that journalists get more and more leaks. We're now in that situation where we're almost overwhelmed with leaks. And I would quote Frederick Obermeier, whom we interviewed for this project, and who told me that the challenge now was not to deal with one leak, but to find the leak among dozens of leaks that would be a good story without spending too much time on it. So this is where we are. And of course, AI is inviting itself to the discussion because it's also becoming easier to forge a leak or to change parts of a leak. And so, yeah, this is how we started to work, and we identified all the origins of a leak. And I think it's great to have this in mind when you're a journalist. You have two main origins of the leaks: hackers and leakers. Hackers are people who don't have a privileged access to leak, and so they will use technical tools to retrieve the leaks. Some of them are doing this for what they consider are good reason, and we can call them hacktivists, which is a contraction of hacker and activist. And some are obviously malicious actors, bad actors. Some are doing that for political reasons or money. We can think of ransomware groups being in that category. And the leakers are another group. Leakers are people who have a privileged access to data and who decide to make the data available or to share the data with a journalist because they think it's important to expose governmental or corporation misconduct. Some of the leakers can decide to reveal their identity, which was the case of Mark MacGann, who is with us today and who is known as the whistleblower, as the UberFi whistleblower, but he's much more than that. And some of the leakers can decide to stay anonymous, and because they're afraid of retaliation or legal consequences. So, of course, when you're a journalist, depending on who you're dealing with, your whole assessment of a leak will be very different. And it's obviously much easier to get fact-checking elements when you're working with somebody like Mark MacGann, who is ready to help you understand the documents you're dealing with and who will answer your questions. That makes your work much easier, but it's also an exception usually. And another shift I wanted to underline was the shift towards more and more transparency. A few years ago, when a journalist got a leak from a hacker, they would usually present it as a leak coming from an anonymous source. This is less and less the case. I think we're being more and more transparent. And just as a reference, I can mention an investigation we worked on at Forbidden Story called Mining Secrets, and it was shared with us by a group that defined itself as a hacktivist group, a group of hackers called Guacamaya. And we decided with Laurent, the director of Forbidden Story, to publish the interview of the hacker and to be totally transparent. And I think this transparency is also important for our audience, our readers, and help them assess what we're sharing with them.
Yeah, for sure. So Mark, that kind of brings me to your perspective on a lot of this stuff. Can you give us a little insight into? So Sandrine's talking a bit about the sources of where these data sets and this information can come from, but give us a little bit of a sense for those of us who may not know what it's like. What goes into the decision to share this information, and sort of maybe even touch on a little bit how journalists might be able to separate a legitimate leaker or whistleblower from someone who's trying to mislead them. But yeah, just if you could, just a little bit about the decision and sort of getting to the point where you're ready to share this kind of information.
Thanks, Robert. I mean, as with many things in life, no two cases are identical, and indeed, probably my case is more the exception than the rule, because I had tremendous amount of data on digital and hard copy form, and there were various personal internal discussions that you have with yourself before you decide to take that life-changing step and blow the whistle and give up your anonymity, which was my case. In terms of the journalist, the receiving side or the demand side for essential public information via leaks such as mine, when you think about everything, when you think about risking everything by blowing the whistle, you want to be as sure as you can that you're leaking to the right person or the right people. And what that means in journalistic terms is that you want, to the extent possible, to be working with experienced investigative journalists who will do justice both to your decision and to the data that you provide. So given the nature and the volume of the Uber files data, it was essential to have the international breadth and depth of journalists working on the national stories in local languages, which is what the ICIJ partnership provided, via The Guardian. You want to work with journalists who won't try to screw you over, to be perfectly blunt. Prior to being introduced to the Guardian investigations team, Christmas 2021, I had investigative journalists come to my door and expect to sort of, be given a bunch of laptops and to turn heel and leave away, right off into the sunset. So there's a kind of a unwritten ethics as to how you should be dealing with whistleblowers and sort of kind of the bedside manner, so to speak, of investigative journalists. And although it's not the journalist's role or responsibility to be your friend or your lawyer, you would expect them to be decent, respectful people. So with Paul Lewis and the Guardian team, again, I'm the exception that doesn't really confirm the rule. I hit the jackpot, and thanks to them, not only was I kind of an active pro bono research assistant during the 6 months of work with them, and ultimately it became 180 journalists in 40 media organizations around the world. But they kind of quid pro quo. They had organized for me, prior to me being revealed as the source of the Uber files and going public, organized great whistleblower support with an organization called Signals Network, great whistleblower lawyers, SEC lawyers, Mary Inman and Poppy Alexander at Whistleblower Partners. To come to your second question, as to knowing if a source is legit or not, I would say that's more of an art than a science. And it, again, very much depends on the specific circumstances of each case. Right now here, the research work at Harvard, and I'm involved in a project that's working on prototypes to authenticate people while preserving their anonymity within, so-called trusted execution environments. Now, there are various methods for doing this: tokenization, digital watermarking, use of metadata. And the next step will be to reduce the friction or the clunkiness that's involved in ensuring the safe and verifiable transmission of this essential public information to journalists and to lawyers.
Cool. Yeah, I actually I want to get more into that in a minute too. But first, Paul, I wanted to ask you, from your point of view, just in terms of scale. I know you deal a lot with scale of leaks, and to Sandrine's earlier point, that is changing. Can you give us a sense of how that's changing, the scale of leaks from the way you see it, and how you're dealing with it, and maybe how other journalists who don't have quite the same resources can navigate that?
Sure, Robert, and hi, everybody. I mean, at OCCRP, we're dealing with lots of leaked information with large volumes. And I can say we get about at least 5 terabytes a month, if not more, some months. And we work with organizations like Distributed Denial of Secrets, who are, for instance, a big provider of leaks, and others. And I mean, there's no denial about the fact that leaks have shaped, the investigative reporting industry in a big way. And leaks have actually exposed both the opportunity that comes with investigative reporting as well as the limitations that come with investigative reporting. And that's kind of an interesting interplay, because obviously we deal with more and more data, more and more leaks, be them from leakers or from other kind of sources. But we're also understanding a lot better that the investigative reporting in the public interest doesn't necessarily sit in one leak or another, but at the intersection of leaks and at the intersection between leaks, public data, field work, and other type of investigative reporting works. So we're now very much aware that with the new formats that the leaks come in, we'll have to deal with a lot more. So like, let's say right now, and it's not just leaks, it's public data as well. between us and ICAJ and other organizations that have platforms like at OCCRP, we have a platform called Aleph, where we ingest the leaks, where we ingest public data, and we're able to do all sorts of cross-referencing and such. And obviously ICAJ has data share and others. But between us, we probably work with about 0.5 petabyte of data overall, not just the leaks. I mean, the whole data batch out there. Now, that is not a lot, in fact. But with the nature of leaks changing, with more of like video content being leaked, for instance, and other things like this, we'll have to increase our capacity many folds. And right now, the limit, we've reached the limit because we're paying too much, for the compute power to companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon and all of those. But we're not also not able to process various types of leaks, that come in other shapes and forms. So the idea is that the leaks kind of exposed our limits as investigative reporters and kind of propelled us, towards something new where we need to increase our capacity to work with leaks. It also, showed us the opportunity in leaks and the fact that because if you think about Panama Papers, Panama Papers is obviously one of the greatest leaks that ever happened with investigative reporting that, that kind of changed the architecture of how we do things. But at the same time, if you put it in the bigger perspective, the leak was from the 4th largest law firm in Panama. There are 3 other companies there, law firms, that were working along the same lines with corrupt officials, corrupt politicians, and so on, organized crime, and all of that. That we don't have access to that data. So the idea, leaks kind of made us conscious of the fact that investigative reporting is really useful to the public when we present the public with, look, this is what we were limited by. This is what we're working with. We need a lot more data and a lot more investigators to be able to make sense of this data. So I think that's where the interplay is right now. And the other thing is that I don't believe we're discussing enough is the security around leaks, not only for the people providing, the brave people providing the leak, but for the journalists and other people using the leak in various ways. So that's also something that has changed with this era of leaks. And one more point is that I think we're more and more aware that leaks are actually entry points towards something bigger, towards something that can work even better in the public interest. And we've seen this in the past 3 or 4 years with various leaks coming from the global south, not from the north. And it's really important to kind of keep in mind the fact that these leaks, although coming from the global south, they are great entry points towards global type of issues. And it's why it's very important to kind of direct the networks and kind of work with networks that not necessarily start in the West. So that's another thing that came with the fact that we can use leaks, coupled with the public data, with field work and other things like this, in a bit more of an efficient way.
Yeah. So another piece of this is also the communication involved in transmitting the leaks, in communicating with the journalists. Mark, can you give us a sense of maybe some of the ways? I know in your particular situation, it was sort of a little bit more straightforward, but in terms of your knowledge and broader research, some of the ways in which whistleblowers can communicate safely with journalists, to Paul's earlier point, the safety around all of it.
Sure. I mean, my case was, you could almost write a book just about how we went about it, but it was me meeting with the Guardian investigations team in Geneva, and I was, schlepping it up there with suitcases full of hard drives and hard copy documents. That's not going to happen anymore because of the intense digital and physical surveillance of employees in the public and of course, especially in the private sector, and not just within tech firms. And given the increased hostility towards people, especially today, speaking up, speaking out in favor of democratic principles and norms. We need to make it easier for whistleblowers to remain anonymous by providing the technical solutions for the delivery, the matching, and the verification of leaks. Some of the work that I'm doing, we're going to show a video at the end on my privacy polls, which is one technical solution. I've just joined the board of a fantastic new whistleblower protection organization called PSST.org. So that's PSST.org, which is building a kind of a digital vault or a safe that's going to match, use machine learning and algorithmic application to match anonymous leaks. So think of, digital or virtual pieces of information coming in like pieces of a jigsaw from random people within the same organization who don't even know that each other exists. And then there's a filter to set a minimum level of a burden of proof, of evidence of actual wrongdoing, to separate the legitimate cases from the frivolous cases. But if you as a regulator or as a media organization want to have oversight on the tech industry and insight into what's actually happening behind closed doors, there's a massive information asymmetry. So as Paul was talking about with Aleph Pro or ICIJ with data share, for just the hosting and the protection of the data once it comes out, that requires huge investment so that you have the actual technology tools to try and keep pace with the people or the companies or the entities that you're trying to report on. But to come back to the supply side of information, meaning the leaker, the whistleblower, and my advice would always be to try and preserve your anonymity, because once you become a whistleblower, you cannot put that genie back in the bottle and it completely transforms your life. But if we can get this technology to a place where it's as simple as using a very discreet confidential app and it's verifiable, so it's not wasting the journalist's time and it's not wasting the lawyer's time, that's what we all aspire to. The last thing I would say is that I'm aware of a lot of work going on the demand side. So OCCRP, ICIJ, all the big media organizations like The Guardian, New York Times, The Post, investing a lot of money in tech and their own individual solutions. The Guardian just came out with a new feature on its mobile app to anonymously report information. On the supply side, the likes of PSST.org or the Shorenstein Center Public Interest Tech Lab doing this My Privacy Polls tech, everything's happening in silos. And I think there has to be some sort of effort to mutualize the tech solutions on the demand side and on the supply side. That all, as Paul was indicating, in terms of just the storage of these petabytes and terabytes of data, requires a lot of money. And of course, the funding sources for the likes of Paul's organization or PSST.org, et cetera, are narrowing. So I think there has to be some sort of mutualization or cooperation on building the technology in order to be able to help anonymous whistleblowers and to help on the journalist side verify the legitimacy and the value of the information.
Sure. And so that's, so if we think about it, that's the sort of communication, a little bit of the processing, but then there's also the journalist side. So Sandrine, once you have a pile of data, what you've dealt with a lot of these over your career, what is, as you said earlier, as this stuff is increasing, you want to make sure you're spending your time wisely, right? And that you're not just going down a rabbit hole and, sifting through a bunch of information that is not really surprising or useful in the public interest. And so from our conversations and from your experience, what are some of the ways you can go about just like that first layer of sort of making decisions on what's worth your time and what may even be a fake or anything like that to just kind of guide you from the onset?
I'm unmuted. Yeah, I think what we need to keep in mind is of course the public interest. I mean, is this information worth investing months of time in it and resources? The mission of your organization can also limit the scope of what you're looking for. At Forbidden Story, we were working on pursuing the stories of under threat or assassinated journalists. And I mean, in many cases, leaks will not always help you do that. So that was a limit due to their organization. I think it's also important to think in terms of collaboration. Is it possible? I mean, leaks are huge, and a single journalist, a single newsroom is not able to, won't be able to do the work a group can do in a month. It would take years for a single journalist to do it. So is it possible? Do you have the means of creating those groups, of gathering the talents you need to work on a leak? And sometimes you need some technical talents. You would also need people with great sources. You need people who are okay for going on the field. So you need to create that team of person who can help. I think it's also, whatever I say, I mean, you still need to spend some time before taking a decision, to spend some time looking at what you're dealing with, because it's not obvious from reading a file name. I remember Frederick Obermeyer saying to us when we had this discussion that he had spent 3 months on the Cyprus file before deciding that it would become an investigation. So this is a lot of resources for a group. And in some cases, some journalists won't be able to spend. We had this discussion with the Wall Street Journal, who had a very conservative approach when it came to leaks. So these are the main things to keep in mind. And of course, one of the main things is to make sure that you're dealing with an authentic leak. It's not worth spending time if you're realizing that this has been forged, and there are very easy ways and red flags, I think, to keep in mind. And I'm not a tech journalist. This is important to know. I'm really not a tech journalist. I would be very lost if you start speaking me with very sophisticated technical language. I think newsroom need to be able to rely on technical expert and expertise. We at Forbidden Story had, for example, worked with the Amnesty Security Lab experts on the Pegasus project, because it would have been impossible for us, and we did that with OCCRP as well, to verify if the phones we were investigating and the list of phones we had been targeted without those technical evidence. This was huge for the work. We wouldn't have been able to publish anything just based on this leak of phone numbers we had. So it's important to have those technical experts, but being a non-technical journalist is not a handicap, I think. I think it's great to ask the dumb questions, to be very genuine when you start working on a leak. And there are basic red flags. Lorax Horn, the editor-in-chief of DDoS Secrets, that was mentioned by Paul, said something very interesting. It's much easier to forge a 3-page PDF document than a whole email account that would verify itself. So if the leak is very, very short, just be cautious. Also, if the story is too good to be true, you have to ask yourself some questions. I think all the investigative journalists I have been working with are still very traumatized about what happened to The Wire. This is an online investigative media outlet in India. In 2023, they published a forged meta report that was actually, it was supposed to show that Meta was granting some privilege to people from the BJP party, Modi's party, which was actually quite credible when you look at it from the outside, because there have been many critics about Meta in India and how close it was from BJP. But when you started looking into the report, it really didn't fit with what Meta policy was. I mean, it's easy to say now, of course, it wasn't the case at that time because the report was very technical. But yeah, you still have to ask yourself those basic questions. If there is something that seems a bit weird, just again on that Meta story, I remember that after the first report was published, there was another internal email, forged email from Meta that was also published by The Wire, but some journalists had started spotting a language that was a bit weird. So we realized afterwards that this was totally false. So just, I think we need as journalists to ask ourselves the very basic questions. And as Paul said, a leak isn't a story in itself. You need to do your reporting work. And I think this is more and more important in an era of AI. This is something I remember from our discussion at the Nieman Foundation. What's the difference today between a journalist and an AI? It's the reporting we can do. An AI will never be able to go out, get the people on camera or get their story and meet with them. So I think this is super important, and it won't be possible in the future to just rely on technical evidence or on leaks. We'll need to do, as Paul said, we'll need to work at the intersection of different domains.
Yeah, I mean, so Paul, kind of coming to you on that is so you need the human reporting, but you do have a lot of the technical ability, and also the breadth of the data that you have also creates another sort of tool for you. And can you talk a little bit about that and how you use that to verify or to go through, say, a new data set, how you cross-reference any of that stuff?
Sure. So first of all, just to add to what Sandrine was saying, I mean, right now we're very inefficient with dealing with leaks. And I'm very happy that Mark was good with the outcome, that came from his cooperation. That's great. But generally, you're given terabytes of data, and you probably use a very small portion out of those terabytes, for your reporting. And I can give our own example at OCCRP. We had a few years ago, we had a very successful project called the Troika Laundromat, where we got leaked these banking records, from a few banks actually. And those were about $300 billion worth of money laundering on the side of corrupt politicians, organized crime, and all of that. We managed to investigate about 50 billion of that. So there were 250 billion left uninvestigated because we just didn't have the capacity to do that. Now, to be able to even deal with that 50 billion worth of money laundering with those banking records, we had to build a separate system from Aleph, to go through the data and to, we actually called it spin cycle. So sometimes you have to spin off, things from your data platforms in order to deal with, a particular type of leak, to increase a little bit the efficiency. But this being said, so 300 billion, we only investigated 50 billion, but there's about 3.4 trillion US dollars a year in criminal money that goes through the world's financial system. So just to put things a little bit in perspective. So this is indeed where this cooperation between the human intelligence and the technology, plays a very, very important role. Now, at OCCRP, and I know that some of our some of the other networks as well, are working towards bettering their systems. For instance, with we have this alliance with ICIJ, with the Pulitzer Center, with a few organizations out there that we call the Journalism Cloud Alliance. This is, to actually increase the compute power at the level of the whole industry. And this is it's a project that is run right now by GFMD, by the Global Forum for Media Development. So, the idea is to increase the compute power so that we can work with these leaks. But it's not just about working with the leaks, because at the end of the day, the number of investigative reporters is very small. I'm kind of thinking about perhaps 10,000 investigative reporters around the world, and that's not a big number compared to the problem that's out there. So I think these systems, where you create the systems to, streamline the data flows between the leakers and the journalists, between very well-intentioned people and the investigative reporters, that's one part of solving the problem. But really the problem is, how can you work with the massive data that's coming the journalism way? Because there's more and more, and we're overwhelmed. There's a tsunami of data. So that's where, besides ensuring there's this flow that, you know, that's a seamless kind of collaboration, very secure and very all that. But at the end of the day, what are you going to do with the data if you're not able to process all that data in the public interest? So this is where we need to open up the systems, the tech systems that we're developing, as well as the strategies, the investigative reporting strategies towards other people who can do this type of work. You know, so now, I mean, we're discussing for a long time with researchers at universities, you know, who are able to do investigative reporting work seamlessly as well, and others, you know. So going more, you know, about that, what was called some years ago, you know, this citizen reporting, but doing it in a more meaningful way, where you have the infrastructure that provides the opportunity to work with large data sets. And perhaps the role of the investigative reporter is just to provide a blueprint of what can be done. So yes, you have this database, that's a huge database, you know, and you're going to use 1% of that to provide the blueprint. A great investigative article that's going to shake the world, sure. But what about the other 99%? I mean, that's something that can be done by others. If you provide the blueprint, but also the infrastructure, not just hand someone a pen and say, write the story. You gotta, you know, give more to the public, to other people, you know, to be able to kind of follow your footsteps and improve on the way the investigative reporters work. So I think this is going to be the future of investigative reporting. You know, we're going to become more and more of these, you know, providers, this R&D kind of for the investigators of the world, this R&D center for the investigators of the world, to kind of maximize our impact through this. I mean, at OCCRP, we started like years ago this cooperation with activists, where we're you know, kind of equipping activists with means to investigate. We started our collaboration with Transparency International in 2017, and that goes very well. That doesn't mean that the investigative reporters need to be the activists, but it also doesn't mean that you can't share the methods, the strategies, the platforms that you're using for others to be able to do this work on their own.
So do you also want to add a little bit about, for anyone who doesn't know, about Aleph and how folks can use Aleph?
Sure. So Aleph is a platform that's open to investigative reporters mostly. And that's where you can ingest, just like data share with ICAJ, you can ingest data sets. You actually have to be approved first, you know, to be able to use the full capacity of Aleph. And because this is a system of trust at the end of the day. And Aleph, we've indexed about 170 terabytes of data, lots of leaks, lots of public data that when trusted parties get access to Aleph, they have access to all of this data. And then you can use your data, you know, in conjunction with this data that's already sitting inside the system, and you can cross-reference the data. So how Aleph works is you put data in, the system goes over the data, extracts entities. We developed a taxonomy that we call .ftm, follow the money, where it extracts, you know, what the investigative reporters need in order to develop an investigation. So entities like offshore companies, let's say, you know, and lawyers and criminals and business people and so on, so on, so on, so. So based on this, we're actually upping our system right now. As Mark mentioned, you know, we have Aleph Pro that will be launched very soon, where we better optimize the taxonomy and the compute side of things, so that Aleph Pro will be able to work also with a sort of an AI interface where you can ask questions, query the data through actually prompts and questions, and so it's going to become a little bit easier for people to do this type of work. But to just give one example of how Aleph can be used is, like, you take the list of all the politicians in a country and you run that list through Aleph, and it will identify you know, instances of those names, which might not be the politicians that you're looking after, and you have to determine if these are false positives and all of that. But it will find out, you know, if some politician from Romania, for instance, from my own country, has a court case in the US, or they have a company in Brazil, or they, you know, so this there's endless options with a system like Aleph or data share. And the idea is to optimize it so that people without a lot of tech knowledge can use these systems in their own interest, you know, and especially to collaborate across borders and to create that type of journalism that Sandrine was mentioning.
So I want to turn to another aspect of this, which is something that you've all, I think, mentioned to some degree, but is the whistleblower protections. And Mark, I know your current research deals with the current regulatory and legislative environment for whistleblowers. Can you talk about that a little bit? How has it changed in recent years, and what does that mean for journalists dealing with whistleblowers right now?
Sure, I'll jump into that in a second. If I could just come back.
You wanted to add to something Paul said?
Exactly. I think, you know,
I just saw your hand.
Oh, thanks. OCCRP are doing that. ICIJ's data there. As I said before, given, you know, every era has its challenges. Journalists right now are under more pressure because of what's happening in the world, but also because of this technology arms race. And that's why there's a guy actually on the board of Shorenstein called Dick Toffel, who's one of the co-founders of ProPublica. And, you know, given what's happened with the Associated Press getting kicked out of the White House and off Air Force One, he's talking about the need between competitive news organizations to form some sort of NATO for news. So if one's attacked, the others come to the defense. A version of that for me is kind of a NATO for journalistic technology, meaning instead of this individual siloed race to get funding and assign funding to storage, to transmission, to security, etc., that if there was some sort of mutualization, some sort of common infrastructure, and focus the competitive zeal on the actual journalism, the investigation, the quality of reporting, because a media organization cannot be a tech company because it doesn't have those deep pockets and doesn't have the ability to keep raising capital to fund, you know, new server parks or you know, do partnerships with nuclear power stations like Microsoft has done in order to feed the necessary energy. So that's just, I think, you know, maybe it's slightly Marxist and communist for me to say that, but I think that news organizations are always going to be playing, you know, several versions behind unless there's some sort of coming together in order to get the right technology for people to be able to blow the whistle effectively, verified and anonymously, and then the storage and the treatment of that. In terms of the whistleblower protection, I mean, you know, so what I'm doing right now is research that looks at measuring the regulatory and the legislative impact of whistleblowing over the past 20 years to try and provide lawmakers with evidence-based input to strengthen whistleblower protections. There's a bill going through the Senate right now specifically on protecting whistleblowers within the area of AI development, with, you know, the Republicans trying to get a 10-year regulation hands-off for the development of AI, which would just be a huge problem. There's a legislation going through the United Kingdom to create a so-called Office of the Whistleblower, and then next year the European Union is going to update and revise its pan-European whistleblower protection laws. You know, I'm working on the supply and demand of essential public information. So the supply side is all the infrastructure that we're talking about, the tech. The demand side is a lot of the people working or who are watching maybe today, whose role it is to uncover the evidence of wrongdoing and bring it to the attention of the public. But if you look at the Facebook files or the Uber files or Cambridge Analytica or other, you know, exposés, it's important to at some point there's outrage, there are hearings, sometimes there's legislative changes or regulatory changes, sometimes not, and then everyone's attention moves on to the next thing. So there needs to be a stronger infrastructure to make sure that people who make the kind of life-changing decision, some call brave, I might call it stupid, to do what I've done, is that you want to make sure that there's a lasting impact. And again, coming back to this regulatory or information asymmetry that I keep harping on about, you know, I know some of the questions coming in talk about the fact that the journalists don't have the same access to technology or innovation that the private sector has. So you know, anyway, these are some of the stuff that I'm doing with Harvard Kennedy School, thanks to the Knight Foundation.
And so I want to leave time for questions, but Sandrine, do you want to touch quickly on some of the ideas of what can be done with information after it's published. If you want to do that briefly, then we can move on to some questions.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be very brief. There are three options. You can destroy the data if this is a security or legal requirement. This has happened for, I mean, the Guardian said that it destroyed the Snowden data, and you can decide to restrict the access to data, which is the case of the Panama Papers data that are accessible through ICIJ by some journalists. And you can decide to make the data public, which is also a tricky decision because, you know, you never know what is in the data. Perhaps it can reveal some, I mean, there's obviously big privacy and security concern. So yeah, these are the three options. And depending on each case, and each case is always very different, you can decide to one of the three solutions.
Great. So I'll take some of the questions that are coming in. We have one from Rowan Philp. Thousands of potential whistleblowers surely don't leak simply because they don't know how to reach the ideal reporter with email addresses often hidden or use their encrypted channels. How can individual reporters invite valued leaks from less tech-savvy officials? Paul or Sandrine, do you have any thoughts on that?
I can take the first stab at it if Sandrine, if you're fine with it.
Sure.
All right. So, I mean, that's a big problem. That's the big problem, really, because, you know, lots of people come to us and say, well, we have this, you know, bunch of this batch of data, and they want to give it to you, you know, in a completely unsecure way. And you realize the risk, and you try to work with those people, you know, so that they understand what they expose themselves to. I mean, we don't need to go into the, you know, like a lengthy discussion about this, but people, you know, have all sorts of motives to leak information in a particular moment. And as an investigative reporter, is crucial to ensure, first of all, you know, that they are safe. And, you know, I mean, as investigative reporters, we always work with leaks. We don't depend on any of these leaks, you know, to a great extent. So we can say no to leaks. When the leaker is in danger, we can say no to leaks. And we've done this at OCCRP. And I think other organizations have done so too, because we realized that the leaker was not prepared to give you the information because they didn't quite see the extent of the risk that they exposed themselves to. But let's say you're past that moment. You know, and that's where everybody's using like a leak platform, secure leaks or others, and none of them are easy to use. None of them are, you know, ensure that seamless collaboration between the journalists and the people who have the information. So that's where we have to do a lot of work, and I think that's what Mark was speaking about too. That we need to better those systems to make sure that people, you know, are safe while giving the data. And it's also a matter of interacting, of being able to interact with people and to understand the reasoning behind the leak as well. I mean, some leaks come from people who are interested in short selling a stock. You know, will you do that? Will you help them? Is that in the public interest? I mean, every leak comes in so many flavors and with so many debates, discussions. That's why it's important that an organization has the debate mechanism, you know, inside the organization, but also coming from the outside. So there's a, you know, so I think this is a problem that we still have to solve, you know, this seamless collaboration and the understanding of risk and this fight and discussion about the public interest around leaks that Sandrine was mentioning. So I don't think anyone has the right system right now to deal with the problem with the thousands of leakers who are not tech savvy. I honestly don't think I mean, any of us has like a perfect solution to that, and I'm not sure we'll be able to find one too.
And just to complete on that, I mean, I agree with what Paul said totally, 100%. I mean, the fragile moment is always the first connection. So a leaker who genuinely wants to share important information has to be very careful about this first connection, because once there is a contact between a journalist and a leaker, a source, there can be a way of figuring out safe ways of communicating, but it's often at the beginning that there is a mistake. So a leaker has to really be very cautious in his in this first contact he makes with a journalist. And as Mark said, do his work, look at what the journalist published, and yeah, how reliable the journalist can be. But this is really where most of the mistakes happen.
Great. So so another question here from Domenico Mussolino. Since you all said we are nowadays overwhelmed with data, have you ever dealt with unintentional leakers? I mean, people who share data that they don't think are sensitive while they are. Any experience with that, or tips on how to deal with that?
I mean, at OCCRP, we do deal with all types of situations. Yeah, indeed, with people who believe the data says something. I can give you one quick example. Like there was this guy who some organized crime group stole from him about $500,000. And he initiated a court case against intermediaries that that were involved with his business. But part of that court case, they subpoenaed all these banking records from this place, from one of the Baltic countries, and this all went to a court records, and the person who called us gave us access to the court case in a country where you don't have public access to court cases, right? So it wasn't a leak like in a wide sense, but by having access to that court case, what we could see in that court case was that his case was very, very small, was not what was important to us as journalists and not what was important to the public. His case was the $500,000, but there were 800 million of money stolen from other parts of the world, from people, from all of that. So it's sometimes, and this created a little bit of tension, right? Because that person wanted us to investigate his case, and we said, yeah, well, your case is actually part of something much, much, much bigger. So, but he didn't realize that at first, and then he realized it, and then we had a good, talk about it, and I think we came to very, very good terms with that. But that happens quite often, and it's also very often that people don't understand the risk that they expose themselves to by giving you the information, because again, they don't check the leak in its entirety. They're focused sometimes on certain aspects of the leak that they know about, that interest them. But the context of the leak is also what matters, and that's perhaps something that some of the leakers sometimes don't understand, and journalists don't understand either. So providing the context to the leaker is very, very important if you can see it, and very often you don't, and you only realize the importance of a leak with time. And it's why it's important to store leaks, because even with Panama Papers, some of the stories came many years after the leak itself, because information is power in context, and the context is ever changing. And that's where one leak that is given to you at some point in time may get a completely different meaning in 5 years' time or such. So it's a variety of things there that we should be concerned about, and because when you protect someone who gives you information, is not just that particular moment, when they give you the leak. It's really about the longer term that you have to have in mind, and you can't always foresee what's going to happen out of that leak.
So a former colleague of mine, Hilke Schulman, asks a question sort of similar to what we've already touched on, but maybe some other points to make here. She says, the panel is making great points about forged leaks. Now that machines can generate whole slews of documents and government agencies may not want to confirm that a document is authentic, how can we authenticate documents? What are some strategies newsrooms and reporters are using?
I mean, this is where the human reporting is important. I agree with that question. I mean, requests for response and the list of very detailed questions journalists need to send to the person incriminated by a story, if this is a leak-based story, is super important. And in some cases, the answer will help you assessing the authenticity of a leak. But clearly, in some cases, you won't get any answer from the people you send the questions to. And that can be a trap as well. That can be a way of trapping journalists. So you have to be very cautious about that. And you need to develop as many sources, human sources, and way of verifying the information as possible. And in some cases, this is what Paul said, but we had discussion with many editors who shared with us the fact that they had very solid stories. They were not entirely sure about it and decided not to publish. So, I mean, people who read us need to be aware of that. We don't publish everything. If we're not sure, if investigative serious newsroom are not absolutely sure about how authentic a story is, they would not publish it. This is our ethical code in a way. So, yeah, I think it's very difficult to have a final answer to that question, and it's asked by a journalist, but the more sources you can have and the more human verification you can get on a leak, the stronger you are.
Mark, did you want to weigh in on something?
Yeah, I wanted to come back to something that Paul said in terms of storing the data and then going back to it and, you know, providing fresh stories months, perhaps years after. And I think this also ties into, I don't want to overstep the boundaries between speaker and moderator, but I think it goes to a question that Rowan also asked about what happens when an organization asks for a leaked paper document back post-publication because it's, you know, their legal property. My view, and I'm not a lawyer, but my view is that the data is not and should never be appropriated by the receiving party, whether that's a media organization, a collaborative investigative network, or even a regulator. Again, once someone takes the rare step of putting the data into the public domain, my view is that then it belongs to what some people call the commons. It's everybody's. And to give you the example of the Frances Haugen Facebook leaks, there was an anonymous dump of that data, which is 20,000 screenshots. You know, it's not a ton of information, but it was not organized, not structured, etc. That was dumped, so to speak, at Harvard, at the Shorenstein Center, the Public Interest Tech Lab. And what Dr. Latanya Sweeney and her brilliant team have done over the past 2 years is to, and I just shared the link, fbarchive.org, is with OCR and other algo techniques, is to put together a database for future generations of journalists, academics, researchers, public policy professionals, regulators, to understand in this, you know, really difficult battle to have insight of what's happening in tech firms and inside their platforms, because when Mark Zuckerberg goes to Congress and testifies under oath, it has been proven time and time again that people like him will lie. So if you can store the data for journalistic purposes, keep going back to it. I respect that and I agree with Paul, but also make it available to people in order that we learn from the past. We learn from what's going on with AI, with algos at the moment, so we're better prepared to understand, to use, and to regulate.
We're just about out of time, but I'll go with one more here, which I think sort of applies to some of the things you've spoken about, Paul. Nikolai asks, what opportunities do artificial intelligence open up for investigative journalism? Obviously, AI is really good at working with large sets of data. Are you seeing opportunities to use AI across all these large sets of data that can speed things up for journalists?
We do at OCCRP, and it's mostly work in the back end. Machine learning processes, you know, using the taxonomies that we worked on, you know, being able to identify patterns in large sets of data and things like this, and also on the front end, when it comes to interacting with the data through prompts and other ways that make it easier for people without much technical knowledge to use this type of systems that can be quite complex in their usage, to use them at you know, optimum levels. So yes, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I would also not place ChatGPT on top of any of our data sets, obviously.
Just in case anybody was wondering.
Yeah, the idea is to use your in-house self, your own solutions. Sorry, I'm.
No problem, no problem. So we're just about at time here, everyone. I just wanted to say thank you to Mark, Paul, and Sandrine, and to the Shorenstein Center for having us and for hosting this webinar. And thank you to everybody who showed up today, and for your great questions. This has been really great, and I hope we can continue talking about this as these things evolve. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
We actually have a video that's about the new tech that the Public Interest Tech Lab at Shorenstein is gonna roll out soon. And so I'm going to play it for you guys. 1 second.
In today's media landscape, whistleblowers face extraordinary risks. From strict corporate surveillance to disinformation campaigns designed to discredit the truth once it's revealed. My Privacy Polls, a new patent-pending technology created by the Public Interest Tech Lab, is a disclosure platform centered on anonymity, which gives whistleblowers a secure way to speak up without leaving a trace. Unlike traditional web forms, My Privacy Polls doesn't store, log, or track submissions. Not even the platform itself can identify who sent what. When a trusted journalist sets up an account, a whistleblower simply clicks a link, writes their message, perhaps attaches a piece of evidence, and it's instantly relayed to the reporter's inbox. No account, no metadata, no breadcrumbs. In an age where leaking the truth can result in great personal consequences, My Privacy Polls protects those who take that risk. Because integrity in reporting begins with protecting your source. With My Privacy Polls, anonymity isn't just a feature, it's the foundation.
Okay, all right. So feel free to check that out on your own time. And thank you again for joining this webinar. Have a good one, everybody.